Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting north, far north, to a place where the wind never quite stops complaining. The sun occasionally forgets to show up for months at a time, and people decided, very confidently, that this was an excellent spot to raise families, livestock, and mildly resentful neighbors. So settle in, dim the lights, loosen your shoulders, and let's wander slowly into the world of Viking villages and the quiet, stubborn reasons they never froze solid, even when the Arctic winter did its very best to prove a point. Now, when most of us picture Viking settlements, we imagine snow piled shoulder high, long houses groaning under the weight of ice, and everyone inside wrapped in furs, glaring at the weather as if it personally offended them, which, honestly, it probably did. But here's the strange thing. They survived. Not barely, not temporarily. They lived there for generations. Which immediately raises the uncomfortable question. How? Because by modern standards, these people were working with limited technology, no central heating, no insulation foam, and a worldview that treated frostbite as an unfortunate but acceptable part of life. And yet, their villages didn't turn into frozen tombs each winter. Not because they were tougher, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they were deeply, almost obsessively practical. And also because cold, it turns out, can be negotiated with if you're patient enough. Let's start with the land itself. Viking villages weren't plopped randomly onto frozen misery just for dramatic effect. They were placed carefully, deliberately, often frustratingly so. Sheltered valleys, coastal inlets, slight rises in terrain that avoided flooding, but still caught weak winter sunlight. They knew where wind traveled. They knew where snow collected, and they avoided those places with the quiet confidence of people who had learned the hard way. A Viking choosing a village site was less a romantic explorer and more a grumpy surveyor muttering, "No, not here either," for several weeks. Once settled, they built low, very low. Their homes crouched against the earth like tired animals conserving heat. Long houses weren't tall or airy. They were squat, narrow, and stubbornly horizontal, designed to minimize exposed surface area. Heat loss was the enemy, and vertical ambition was quietly discouraged. And then there were the walls. Thick, almost aggressively thick, packed with layers of timber, turf, sod, stone, and whatever else was available. Turf, especially, was the unsung hero here. It wasn't pretty. It smelled vaguely of damp earth. But it insulated beautifully. These walls didn't just keep cold out. They slowed time. Temperature changes crept rather than rushed. Cold air didn't barge in. It hesitated. It thought about it. Sometimes it gave up. Inside, things became warmer. Not cozy, not modern cozy, but survivable cozy. The kind where you don't think about dying quite as often. At the center of the longhouse burned the hearth. Not a roaring fire. Those waste fuel and oxygen, but a steady, controlled one. Smoke drifted upward and out through roof vents, slowly, reluctantly. Soot built up everywhere. Lungs were probably not thrilled, but heat stayed. And heat in Viking villages was communal. Nobody had a private fireplace. Everyone shared warmth, air, and proximity. You slept close, very close, to people, to animals, sometimes to both. Which brings us to livestock. Because yes, Vikings live with their animals. Not out of affection, though some probably tried, but because warm bodies are warm bodies. Cows, sheep, goats, even horses were sometimes housed on the same roof or in attached structures that shared heat through walls and floors. This was not charming. It was practical. Animals exhale warmth. They radiate heat. They also produce other things. But winter survival encourages flexibility in standards. So the village became a heat network. Homes clustered close together. Paths minimized exposure. Windbreaks built from earth and timber redirected gusts away from entrances. Snow was allowed to pile up against walls because snow, ironically, insulates. Yes, snow helped. Fresh snow traps air. Air slows heat loss. So rather than clearing everything, Vikings let snow gather strategically, turning the village into a strange, frozen cocoon. Inside, clothing did the rest. Wool, lots of it, layered, oiled, repaired endlessly. Well, still insulates when wet, which was fortunate, because everything was wet, constantly. And no, they didn't wash it often. This was not a hygiene-forward society. But that grease and grime helped block wind. Smelled terrible. Worked beautifully. Now, let's talk about fuel. Because keeping a fire going all winter in the north is not a casual affair. Vikings stockpiled like anxious squirrels. Firewood was gathered relentlessly in warmer months. Peat was cut and dried. Driftwood collected. Nothing combustible was wasted. Children learned early. If it burns, we keep it. Winter wasn't a surprise. It was expected, planned for, obsessively discussed. And when storms came, and they always did, the village slowed. Life narrowed. Work became indoor-focused. Repairing tools. Telling stories. Eating preserved food that everyone pretended tasted better than it did. Fermented fish. Dried meat. Sour dairy. Enough calories to survive. Not enough to complain loudly. This rhythm mattered. Constant activity generates heat. Bodies moving inside enclosed spaces raise temperatures subtly but consistently. Nothing frantic, just steady motion. And the houses themselves, having absorbed heat over time, released it slowly. Walls acted like thermal batteries. Floors insulated by earth held warmth long after fires dimmed. So no, Viking villages didn't feel warm, but they didn't freeze either. They existed in a carefully balanced truce with winter, not victory, not defeat. A negotiated settlement where nobody pushed too hard. And this balance shaped the people. They learned patience, endurance, a kind of low-level irritation with the universe that never quite boiled over, which, if we're being honest, explains a lot about later Viking behavior. Raiding was seasonal. Sailing waited for warmer months. Winter was for survival, not adventure. When spring came, it felt earned, deserved, almost sacred. And that's perhaps the quietest reason Viking villages never froze. They respected winter. They didn't challenge it. They prepared for it. They endured it. And then, when it finally left, they took very detailed mental notes for next year. As we drift gently onward, we'll look more closely at daily life inside those longhouses, how people slept, argued, cooked, and quietly judged one another for chewing too loudly during the 9th straight month indoors. But before we do, I'll leave you with a small question to ponder as you relax. If you had survived one Viking winter, sharing a longhouse with family, livestock, smoke, and fermented fish, what would be the hardest part for you? Let's drift onward, then, from the frozen village paths and back inside the longhouse, where the light is low, the air is smoky, and everyone has been together for far too long to pretend they aren't quietly irritated with one another. If you remember where we left off, winter had settled in fully. The snow had piled politely against the walls. The animals were breathing heavily nearby, contributing warmth and an aroma no one commented on anymore. And inside, life slowed into something repetitive, enclosed and strangely intimate. This is where Viking winter really happened. Because surviving the cold wasn't just about architecture or fuel. It was about how people filled the long, dark hours when leaving the house felt optional at best and insulting to common sense at worst. Inside the longhouse, space was shared in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. There were no private rooms, no quiet corners, no personal bubbles. Benches lined the walls, covered in furs and wool, doubling as seating by day and beds by night. Families slept side by side. Children sprawled wherever they fit. Elders claimed spots closest to the fire, because seniority had its perks, and hypothermia was a powerful argument. If you snored, everyone knew. If you talked in your sleep, congratulations, you had an audience. If you were having a bad winter emotionally, well, you were having it publicly. This closeness wasn't romantic. It was functional. Shared body heat mattered. The longhouse, when full, acted almost like a living organism. Dozens of bodies breathing, shifting, murmuring, coughing, and occasionally arguing created a steady, subtle warmth that fires alone couldn't manage. And yes, people argued. Winter magnified everything. Small grievances became epic sagas. Someone ate more dried meat than their share. Someone tracked snow inside. Someone told the same story again and again And again, naturally, they made it worse by having very little to do. But remember, work didn't stop in winter. It just moved indoors. Tools needed repair. Nets were mended. Clothing was patched endlessly. Wool spun into more wool. Because apparently there was never enough wool. Hands stayed busy. Not for productivity alone, but because stillness invited cold. Movement, even slow movement, generated warmth. A spinning wheel turning quietly by the fire wasn't just producing yarn. It was producing heat. The same one for carving, sharpening, stitching. Everyone contributed, even children, whose small tasks mattered more than they probably realized. And then there were the stories. Storytelling was not optional entertainment. It was survival psychology. Long nights demanded distraction. Tales of ancestors, gods, monsters, and feuds stretched time in manageable ways. A story could fill an evening. A good one could fill a week. Some stories were heroic. Some were tragic. Some were suspiciously flattering to the person telling them. But all of them served the same purpose. They made winter shorter. There's something deeply practical about this. A mind engaged in narrative doesn't focus as much on discomfort. Cold becomes background noise. Darkness becomes atmosphere. Hunger becomes something to laugh about later. And laughter mattered too. Dry, understated humor, much like the kind we're using tonight, wasn't out of place in Viking society. It was valued, which showed intelligence. Sarcasm, delivered calmly, was almost an art form. A good insult could be remembered for decades. A bad one could get you quietly disliked forever. Now, while all this sounds cozy in theory, we should gently acknowledge reality. Viking winters were hard. People got sick. Smoke irritated lungs. Infection spread easily. Nutrition dipped. Children didn't always make it through. But here's the key point. Villages didn't freeze because people adapted behavior to environment, not the other way around. They ate high-fat foods in winter, meat, dairy, fish oils, because fat burns slowly and keeps the body warm. They didn't pretend salads were an option. No one lectured anyone about balance. They slept more. Darkness dictated rhythm. Long nights encouraged longer rest, conserving energy. This wasn't laziness. It was efficiency. And when the cold became extreme, villages contracted even further. People stayed inside almost constantly. Doors opened less. Fires burned lower, but longer. Every motion became deliberate. Cold doesn't defeat you when you stop fighting it. It defeats you when you waste energy pretending it isn't there. Vikings, for all their reputation as impulsive raiders, were remarkably conservative in winter. No unnecessary risks. No dramatic journeys. If someone suggested traveling during a storm, the group consensus was usually a slow blink and a quiet no. And then there were the clothes. We touched on wool before, but it deserves a little more attention. Viking clothing was layered with care. Undergarments of linen, outer layers of wool, cloaks fastened tightly, everything designed to trap air and block wind. Clothing wasn't fashion-forward in winter. It was survival-forward. Repairs were constant. A torn seam could mean frostbite. A missing pin could mean drafts. People noticed these things because consequences were immediate. And again, hygiene took a back seat. Grease from lanolin and wool repelled moisture. Dirt filled gaps. Nothing was wasted. If something smelled unpleasant, it was politely ignored. Now, let's talk briefly about children, because winter shaped them early. Viking children grew up understanding cold. They weren't shielded from it entirely, but they weren't exposed foolishly either. They learned where to sit, how to layer, when to move, when to stay still. They learned stories by heart, learned patience, learned that winter was not an enemy. It was a season to be endured quietly. This created adults who didn't panic when conditions worsened. They'd seen it before. They knew it passed. Eventually, which brings us back to villages as a whole. The layout of a Viking settlement encouraged cooperation. No house stood alone. Proximity meant shared labor, shared resources, shared survival. If one fire went out, another could help. If one family ran low, others noticed. Winter made isolation dangerous. Community was insulation. And perhaps that's the most overlooked reason Viking villages didn't freeze. Not turf walls, not fires, not even animals. People. People who understood that survival in extreme environments isn't about strength or bravado. It's about coordination, habit, and the willingness to be slightly uncomfortable together. There's something quietly ironic about that, given how Vikings are often portrayed. Loud, violent, individualistic. And yet, winter demanded the opposite. It demanded restraint, routine, and the humility to admit you needed others. As we let this thought settle, imagine the longhouse again. Fire crackling softly, snow muffling the outside world. Someone telling a story you've already heard twice. You listen anyway, because it passes the time, because it keeps the cold at bay. And as your eyes grow heavy, I'll leave you with another gentle question to carry into the dark. If you had lived in a Viking village during winter, what role do you think you'd take on to get through those long nights? The storyteller? The quiet repairer? The one closest to the fire who mysteriously never moves? Tell me your thoughts in the comments when you wake up, or if you're still awake at all. Let's drift onward then, without standing up too quickly, because the fire is still low, the benches are still hard, and winter has absolutely no intention of rushing for our comfort. If you've stayed with me this far, we're still inside the Viking longhouse. The walls are holding. The snow outside has settled into its quiet, insulating duty. The animals are breathing steadily nearby, contributing warmth and character. And now, as the hours stretch and stomachs begin to notice the passage of time, our attention naturally drifts toward food. Because if there's one thing that truly kept Viking villages from freezing and quietly from falling apart altogether, it was not heroism or toughness. It was calories. Dense, unapologetic calories. Winter eating in Viking society was not about pleasure. It was about survival, fuel, and the grim understanding that spring was a long way off. Food was warmth. Food was energy. Food was time. And time, in winter, mattered more than almost anything else. Let's start with the obvious problem. Northern winters are not exactly friendly to fresh produce. There were no green markets, no winter harvests, no surprise apples tucked away somewhere. If you didn't preserve it before the cold arrived, you simply did not eat it. So preservation became an art, a deeply practical, slightly unpleasant art. Fish was everywhere. Dried, smoked, salted, and fermented in ways that would test the emotional resilience of modern noses. Cod and herring were staples. They were caught in enormous quantities during warmer months, then processed relentlessly. Drying racks stood near villages like skeletal forests. Fish hung stiffly, hardening in the wind. Once dried, they lasted for months. They were tough, chewy, and nutritionally efficient. You didn't eat them because you wanted to. You ate them because they worked. Meat followed similar rules. Beef, pork, lamb, goat, whatever the village could spare without risking its breeding stock, was slaughtered strategically. Meat was smoked over low fires, salted heavily, or air-dried. Fat was prized. Lean meat was fine, but fat was life. And then there was dairy. Milk, fresh, didn't last long. So Vikings transformed it into forms that did. Butter, cheese, skyr-like products, and sour milk preparations filled storage containers. These were high in fat, relatively stable, and deeply comforting in their own way. Not delicious, but reliable. Vegetables existed, but modestly. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and cabbage were stored in cool, dark conditions. They lasted longer than leafy greens, which disappeared early in the season. Berries, gathered obsessively, were dried or preserved with honey when possible. Honey, by the way, was incredibly valuable. It didn't spoil. It sweetened otherwise grim meals. It fermented beautifully into mead, which served not only as a beverage but as morale support. Alcohol in winter was not excess. It was insulation for the spirit. Meals were simple. 1 or 2 main meals a day, often communal. Large pots simmered slowly over the hearth. Stews were common because they maximized ingredients. Bones released nutrients. Fat spread evenly. Everything contributed. A winter stew might include meat scraps, dried fish, grains, roots, herbs, and whatever else was available. It was never the same twice. It was rarely memorable, but it was warm, And warmth, once again, was the point. Eating together mattered, not just socially, but thermally. Bodies gathered around the fire, bowls steaming, hands wrapped around wooden cups. The act of eating raised body temperature. The digestion of heavy foods generated heat. Everything was efficient. There was no snacking culture, no casual eating. Food was structured, respected, occasionally guarded. Arguments over portions happened quietly. Nobody wanted to be known as greedy. Winter reputations lingered. Now, let's pause for a moment and appreciate how much planning this required. Villages calculated winter food needs months in advance. They estimated population, adjusted for livestock, accounted for possible loss. This wasn't written down, it was remembered. Elders held knowledge like living calendars. They knew when supplies ran thin last year. They remembered which storage methods failed. They remembered winters that lingered longer than expected, and they planned accordingly. This collective memory kept villages from freezing just as much as walls or fires. Starvation leads to weakness. Weakness leads to cold. Cold leads to death. Vikings understood this chain instinctively, so they ate even when food was monotonous, even when appetite faded, especially when morale dipped. Winter meals were not about enjoyment. They were about continuity. Now, let's talk briefly about hunger, because yes, hunger existed. Late winter was particularly hard. Supplies dwindled. Meals shrank. Portions were watched closely. But outright starvation was not common in well-managed villages. Not because resources were abundant, but because sharing was enforced by necessity. A hungry neighbor was a future burden. A fed neighbor was insurance. And if things went truly badly, storms failed preservation, loss of livestock, then yes, suffering followed. But the system itself was designed to prevent collapse. Food storage areas were protected carefully. Raised platforms kept supplies away from moisture and pests. Containers were sealed with fat resin or wax. Nothing was casual. Children learned early not to waste food. Scraps went into stews. Bones were boiled repeatedly. Even after meals, leftovers were carefully managed. This wasn't joyless. It was purposeful. And in a strange way, winter food culture brought comfort. Predictability is soothing. Knowing what you'll eat when you'll eat, and that it will be enough reduces anxiety. And anxiety, left unchecked, is exhausting. So, winter meals anchor the day. Morning tasks. Midday meal. Evening storytelling. Night sleep. Routine became warmth. As the weeks passed, bodies adjusted. Metabolism slowed slightly. Movement became economical. Energy was conserved. And when people dreamed of spring, they did so quietly. Loud hope wastes energy. Now imagine again the longhouse. The stew pot simmering gently. Someone stirs it absent-mindedly. The smell is familiar, not exciting. Familiar. A child asks when spring will come. An elder shrugs. Soon enough, which means nothing and everything, because everyone knows it always comes. Eventually, that knowledge, passed down through countless winters, is perhaps the most important ingredient of all as we drift onward from food and into the deeper rhythms of winter life. I'll leave you with another small question to consider gently, without urgency. If you had to eat the same simple meals for months on end, knowing they were keeping you alive, would you find comfort in the routine, or would you quietly dream of something different? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake, or if you're still listening. Let's drift onward, then gently, without disturbing the fire too much, because the stew pot has finally been set aside, the bowls have been scraped clean, and the longhouse is settling into that heavy, quiet moment that comes after eating. The kind where everyone feels just a little warmer, a little slower, and vaguely aware that there's absolutely nowhere else to go. If food carried Viking villages through winter physically, then sleep and the careful management darkness carried them through mentally. Because winter in the far north is not just cold. It is long, relentless, and unapologetically dark. Modern people like to say things like, I love winter nights, usually while surrounded by electric lighting, entertainment, and accompanying knowledge that sunrise is only a few hours away. Viking winter nights were something else entirely. In some regions, daylight dwindled to a weak, gray suggestion. In others, it vanished almost completely. And yet, villages did not descend into panic, madness, or collective despair. Not because they were immune to darkness, but because they structured their lives around it. Sleep in Viking winter was not a single event. It was a rhythm. People slept longer, yes, but also differently. Night sleep stretched. Daytime rest crept in. Short naps happened naturally, especially during the darkest weeks. This wasn't laziness. It was adaptation. When light is scarce, energy must be conserved. Inside the longhouse, sleeping arrangements shifted subtly with the season. Benches lined with furs became more crowded. People slept closer together. Children were tucked between adults. Elders claimed favored spots near the fire, and no one argued too loudly about it, because everyone hoped to be old someday too. Furs mattered enormously here. Animal skins weren't just blankets. They were insulation layers, wind blockers, and sometimes status symbols. A well-cured fur trapped heat efficiently. Several layered together could turn a drafty bench into something almost comfortable. Almost. But comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. And sleep was how the body repaired itself against cold stress. Muscles relaxed. Heat redistributed. Calories were processed. Immune systems did their quiet work. People learned to sleep through noise, through snoring, through coughing, through animals shifting nearby. Silence was rare. You didn't wait for perfect conditions. You adapted. And darkness, true darkness, changed perception of time. Without clocks, without artificial lighting, nights blurred. Stories stretched. Conversations slowed. People stopped marking hours precisely. Instead, they moved by feeling. Hunger, fatigue, cold. This is where storytelling returned, not as entertainment, but as structure. Stories often began after the evening meal and drifted towards sleep. Their pacing mattered. A good storyteller knew when to let a tale taper, when to lower their voice, when to repeat familiar phrases that signaled rest. Myths weren't told to shock or thrill. They were told to soothe. Even stories of gods, monsters, and death were delivered calmly, predictably, because familiarity itself was comforting. Fear was a waste of energy. And yet, the darkness still pressed in. Humans are not built for months without sunlight. Vikings were no exception. They experienced melancholy, fatigue, irritability. But again, they adapted behavior rather than fighting biology. Winter was not the time for emotional excess. Disputes were delayed when possible. Big decisions postponed. Marriages arranged for warmer months. Legal assemblies suspended or minimized. The village became inward-facing. Preservation, maintenance, endurance. Light sources were minimal but important. Fires provided the main illumination, flickering low and uneven. Oil lamps existed, using animal fat or fish oil. They burned dimly, producing more smell than light, but they mattered. Light meant wakefulness. Too much light at night was unnecessary and wasteful. Darkness encouraged sleep. Sleep conserved energy. And so villages embraced darkness instead of resisting it. There was no concept of beating winter blues. There was acceptance. Winter was heavy. So people moved more slowly, spoke less, expected less of themselves. This cultural permission to rest was essential. It prevented exhaustion. It prevented reckless behavior. Children were not forced into constant activity. Elders were not pressured to contribute beyond their limits. Everyone's role shifted subtly toward stillness. This didn't mean inactivity. It meant efficiency. And when storms came, and they did, sleep became even more crucial. Storms trapped people indoors completely. Fires burned steadily. Food was rationed carefully. Conversations quieted. During these periods, people slept more, not out of boredom, but necessity. Bodies needed warmth. Sleep helped maintain it. Animals, too, rested more. Their presence added warmth, but also reinforced the seasonal rhythm. Everything slowed together. And here's something quietly fascinating. Vikings did not see winter darkness as abnormal. It was expected, anticipated, prepared for emotionally. They named it wrote poetry about it, built myths around it. Darkness became part of the world's balance, not a flaw. The sun would return. It always had. That belief mattered more than optimism. It was certainty. Now, imagine waking during the night. The fire still glowing faintly. Shadows moving slowly across turf walls. Snow pressing silently outside. You hear breathing. Someone shifts. A child murmurs in sleep. You don't panic. You don't check the time. You simply pull a fur tighter and rest again. That trust that the system works, that morning will come, is what kept villages from unraveling. Without it, cold would have crept in through cracks of the mind long before it reached the body. And so, day by day, night by night, winter passed. Not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily. As we drift onward, we'll soon turn our attention to something slightly less soothing but deeply important: how social order, authority, and small power struggles behaved under winter pressure, and why Viking villages managed to stay functional when everyone was tired, cold, and sharing the same air. But before we do, let me leave you with another gentle question to hold on to as your eyes grow heavy. If you lived through months of near-constant darkness, do you think you'd adapt by slowing down, or would you fight it? Try to keep your old rhythm alive? Tell me what you think in the comments. Whenever you wake, or whenever the darkness feels quiet enough to answer, let's drift onward again gently, without announcing ourselves too loudly, because the Longhouse has settled into that peculiar winter calm where everyone is awake just enough to notice one another, but too tired to make a fuss about it. The fire still glows. The darkness still presses softly against the walls. And now, with food eaten and sleep woven into strange new patterns, something else begins to matter more than ever: people. Because winter doesn't just test buildings or supplies. It tests relationships, authority, patience, and the fragile social glue that keeps a village from quietly unraveling when everyone is cold, cramped, and very much over it. In warmer months, Viking villages could afford a bit of friction. People worked outdoors. Space existed. Tempers cooled quickly when someone could simply walk away. Winter removed that luxury. There was nowhere to storm off to, no fields to disappear into, no boats sailing away dramatically into the distance. If you were annoyed with someone, you slept next to them. This made social structure incredibly important. Viking villages were not lawless gatherings of impulsive warriors. They were tightly regulated communities with clear expectations, even if those expectations were enforced more by memory and reputation than written rules. Winter amplified this. Every village had figures of authority: chiefs, elders, household heads. Their power wasn't absolute, but it was respected, especially in winter, when coordination mattered more than personal pride. Decisions about food distribution, fuel use, repairs, and shelter arrangements were not casual. They were discussed carefully, often with more listening than speaking. Elders spoke slowly. Experience mattered more than enthusiasm. A reckless decision in winter didn't just affect one person. It endangered everyone. So impulsive behavior was discouraged. Loud arguments were frowned upon. Displays of anger were seen as childish, not strong. Self-control was admired, especially when conditions were harsh. This doesn't mean people were perfectly calm. They were human. They snapped. They sulked. They held grudges. But winter culture nudged those emotions inward rather than outward. And when conflict did arise, and it did, it was often dealt with quietly. A word here, a look there, a reminder of shared survival. Public confrontations were avoided. Violence within the village was rare, not because Vikings were gentle, but because winter violence was inefficient. An injured person required care. Care required resources. Resources were already stretched thin, so disputes were postponed when possible. "We'll talk about it in spring" was a powerful phrase. Spring became the season for action. Winter was for endurance. Children learned this early. Winter behavior was stricter. Less tolerance for noise. Less tolerance for wandering. Less tolerance for waste. They were expected to observe, help quietly, and understand that survival depended on cooperation. This created a subtle hierarchy of behavior. The more you disrupted winter routines, the more quietly you were judged, and judgment mattered. Viking society relied heavily on reputation. What people thought of you could determine whether others helped you, trusted you, or defended you later. Winter was when reputations were quietly reinforced. Who shared fairly, who complained excessively, who worked steadily without being asked. These things were noticed, remembered, and discussed softly when you weren't listening. This social memory kept villages stable. It encouraged generosity without needing enforcement. It discouraged selfishness without constant confrontation. And it worked. Now, let's talk about leadership specifically, because winter leadership looked different from summer leadership. There were no raids to plan, no assemblies to dominate, no dramatic displays of power. Winter leaders were quiet organizers. They monitored supplies, settled disputes with a glance, allocated resources calmly. Their authority was expressed through steadiness rather than command. A good winter leader didn't speak often, but when they did, people listened. Poor leaders struggled. Impulsive ones lost respect quickly. Anyone who hoarded, favored unfairly, or ignored communal needs found themselves isolated. Winter was unforgiving that way. Isolation, by the way, was dangerous. Emotional isolation often preceded physical danger. If no one checked on you, if no one shared food, if no one noticed when you were ill, community wasn't sentimental. It was survival math. This also affected gender roles, which were more flexible than popular imagination suggests. Winter required everyone to contribute where possible. Women managed food storage, clothing repair, and household coordination. Men handled repairs, tool maintenance, and fuel management. But these roles overlapped constantly. Competence mattered more than custom. Elders, especially, held power in winter. Their memory of past winters guided decisions. They remembered what failed. They remembered how long supplies lasted. Their caution saved lives. Children listened to them more in winter. Fear sharpened attention. And fear, when managed calmly, became respect. Winter also tested emotional endurance. Grief, if present, lingered. There were fewer distractions. Losses were felt more acutely. Villages acknowledged this quietly. There were rituals for the dead, even in winter. Simple ones. Words spoken softly. Shared meals. Stories told to keep memory alive. Grief was communal because isolation weakened everyone. And then there were the nights when tempers flared despite everything. Someone snapped. A sharp word. A raised voice. The long house went still. Everyone noticed. Silence followed. And then, almost always, someone intervened gently. A joke. A reminder. A change of subject. De-escalation was a skill practiced unconsciously because no one wanted winter conflict. Now imagine living like this for months. Every reaction moderated. Every emotion measured. Not suppressed, but shaped. It changed people. Viking culture valued restraint far more than its reputation suggests, especially in winter. Strength wasn't loud. It was consistent, and this consistency kept villages functioning. They didn't freeze socially because they adapted emotionally. They accepted limits, adjusted expectations, chose cooperation over pride. When spring finally came, and it always did, it felt explosive by contrast. Energy released, arguments resolved, decisions made, movement returned. But winter was where endurance was forged. As we drift onward, we'll soon explore how belief systems, gods, rituals, and quiet superstitions helped Viking villages make sense of winter and reinforce the behaviors that kept them alive. But before we step into that softer, stranger territory, I'll leave you with another small question to consider as you rest. If you were part of a village where winter demanded constant self-control and cooperation, do you think you'd thrive in that quiet discipline, or would the closeness slowly wear you down? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake, or whenever the night feels long enough to answer. Let's drift onward again, slowly, carefully, as if we're stepping across a floor we know well enough not to look down at anymore. The longhouse is quieter now. The earlier tension has softened into something manageable. People are tired, fed, and resigned to the fact that winter is still very much in charge. And in moments like this, when effort gives way to endurance, the mind starts reaching for something beyond walls and fire. Belief, not the dramatic kind, not shouting at the sky belief, but the quiet, habitual kind that settles in during long nights and gives shape to things that can't be controlled. Because winter, for Viking villages, was not just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one. And belief systems, gods, spirits, customs, superstitions, were part of how people made sense of months that felt endless, dark, and indifferent. Viking religion wasn't centralized. There was no single authority issuing official interpretations. Belief lived locally, shaped by landscape, family, and experience. Winter intensified this. People leaned into familiar rituals not because they expected miracles, but because rituals created order, and order calmed the mind. The gods were present, but not sentimental. Odin was wise, distant, and demanding. Thor was protective but volatile. Freyr governed fertility and prosperity, which made him especially relevant in winter, when people worried constantly about whether spring would come back properly. People didn't pray for comfort. They prayed for continuity. Small offerings were made. Food, drink, words spoken softly near the fire. Not elaborate ceremonies. Winter didn't have the energy for that. But steady acknowledgement. We remember you. Please remember us. These acts weren't about fear. They were about relationship. The gods weren't expected to prevent winter. Winter was part of the world. But maybe, just maybe, they could make it survivable. And even if they couldn't, the act of offering reminded people they weren't alone in the dark. Superstitions grew stronger in winter, not because people became more foolish, but because uncertainty increased. Strange sounds outside took on meaning. Dreams felt heavier. Silence felt louder. People noticed patterns. They always had. But winter sharpened attention. A sudden storm after careless words might be remembered. A warm spell following an offering might be noted. These connections weren't scientific, but they were comforting. They suggested cause and effect in a world that otherwise felt arbitrary. And importantly, these beliefs reinforced practical behavior. Waste angered spirits, so people avoided waste. Disrespect disrupted balance, so people practiced restraint. Breaking taboos invited misfortune, so people followed routines carefully. Belief became behavioral glue. Winter also gave space for myth. Long nights were ideal for retelling stories of creation, destruction, and survival. These myths weren't escapism. They mirrored reality. Fimbulwinter, the great winter that preceded the end of the world, was a familiar concept. A season of cold, darkness, and hardship before renewal. Sound familiar? Of course it does. By framing winter as part of a cosmic cycle, Vikings placed their suffering within a larger narrative. This mattered deeply. It meant winter wasn't meaningless. It was necessary. And necessity is easier to endure than randomness. Children grew up hearing these stories during winter nights. They learned that hardship was expected, that survival required patience, that even gods endured loss and struggle. This normalized difficulty. It didn't erase discomfort, but it prevented despair. Now, belief wasn't always gentle. There were fears, too. Spirits of the dead were thought to linger more in winter. Boundaries felt thinner. People behaved carefully at night. Certain words weren't spoken. Certain places avoided. Again, not hysteria. Just caution. Caution kept people inside, kept them together, kept them alive. Winter rituals were often subtle. Lighting a fire a certain way, saying a phrase before sleep, sharing a drink at a particular time. These habits anchored days that otherwise blurred together. Routine is belief's quiet cousin. And rituals weren't only religious. They were social. Shared meals followed patterns. Sleeping arrangements shifted at certain times. Even storytelling had seasonal rules. The predictability reduced anxiety. Now, let's talk briefly about fate, because Vikings thought about it often, especially in winter. The concept of fate wasn't defeatist. It wasn't resignation. It was acceptance of limits. Some things could be prepared for. Some couldn't. Winter fell into both categories. You could stock food, build shelter, manage conflict. You couldn't control storms. Or illness. or sudden loss. Believing in fate allowed people to grieve without collapsing, to accept misfortune without unraveling. It didn't remove pain, but it contained it. And again, this prevented social breakdown. People didn't blame endlessly. They mourned, adjusted, and moved forward. Winter required forward motion, even when slow. Belief systems also helped explain survival itself. When a village made it through a particularly harsh winter, it wasn't seen as luck alone. It was seen as balance maintained, as proper behavior rewarded. This reinforced cooperation for the next year. And here's something quietly important. Vikings didn't romanticize winter. They didn't pretend it was beautiful or noble. Their beliefs didn't sugarcoat hardship. They acknowledged it fully. That honesty mattered. There's comfort in not being lied to by your own culture. So, winter belief wasn't about hope in the modern sense. It was about endurance, about aligning behavior with reality, about finding meaning that didn't demand immediate happiness. And because of that, villages didn't freeze, not mentally, not socially, not spiritually. They remained cohesive. As the weeks passed, subtle changes were noted. A little more light at midday, a softer quality to the darkness. People commented quietly, not excitedly. Winter wasn't over yet, but belief whispered that it would be. Now imagine yourself there again. Fire low, stories drifting. A sense, not of optimism, but of continuity. You sleep knowing tomorrow will resemble today. And that is enough. As we drift onward from belief into the physical environment again, we'll soon explore how the land itself, snow, ice, wind, was not just endured, but quietly used by Viking villages to their advantage. But before we do, let me leave you with another gentle question, one you don't need to answer quickly. If belief helped you endure something difficult, not by promising relief, but by offering meaning, would that be enough for you? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake, or whenever the night feels patient enough to listen. Let's drift onward again, carefully, almost without noticing the passage from one thought to the next, because winter is still holding the village in its quiet grip. And by now, everyone has learned that resistance is unnecessary. The fire burns low. Belief has settled into routine. And something subtle has shifted. Winter is no longer just something to survive. It has become something to use. This may sound strange, because cold rarely presents itself as helpful. But Viking villages, after generations of observation and trial, learned that winter, harsh as it was, could be predictable. And predictability, even when unpleasant, is valuable. Snow, for example, wasn't just tolerated. It was welcomed. Snow packed around buildings sealed cracks and gaps that summer repairs never quite fixed. It muffled sound, reducing heat loss through vibration. It insulated foundations. Villagers didn't rush to clear snow from walls. They shaped it. They let it accumulate where it helped and removed it where it threatened collapse. Snowdrifts became tools. Ice, too, had its uses. Frozen ground made transport easier. Heavy loads slid over ice on sleds far more efficiently than they ever could over muddy summer paths. Winter roads appeared where none existed before. Villages connected more easily across frozen rivers and wetlands. Trade, limited but important, often happened in winter because routes were clearer and more stable. This changed how villages thought about isolation. Winter closed some paths, but opened others. Fishing continued through ice. Holes were cut carefully. Nets lowered. Knowledge of currents and ice thickness was passed down precisely. A mistake here was deadly, so procedures were followed strictly. Ice fishing provided fresh food during a season otherwise dominated by preserved supplies. It broke monotony, lifted morale, provided variety without excess. Wind, too, became an ally. Winter winds dried clothes and furs more effectively than damp summer air. Smoke dispersed more reliably. Villages oriented structures to guide wind away from entrances and toward smoke vents. None of this was accidental. These were learned behaviors, passed down quietly, corrected firmly when ignored. Children learned early which paths were safe on ice, which sounds signaled danger, which textures meant stability. Winter literacy was essential, and then there was time itself. Winter slowed life, yes, but it also created focus. Without fields to tend or voyages to plan, attention turned inward. Skills refined, tools improved, strategies discussed. Winter was when planning happened. Raids were imagined, trade deals considered, disputes prepared for resolution in spring. People talked through scenarios slowly, carefully, without urgency. This mental work mattered. It made warmer months more efficient. Winter became the thinking season. And again, this kept villages from freezing socially. Minds stayed active, even as bodies rested more. Now let's talk about storage, not just food, but heat. Viking villages used thermal mass instinctively. Thick walls absorb heat during active periods and release it slowly. Floors insulated by earth moderated temperature swings. Fires weren't stoked aggressively. They were maintained. A steady burn provided more usable heat than dramatic flames. Smoke, unpleasant as it was, also signaled heat retention. If smoke lingered, warmth stayed. Villages learned how long embers lasted, how to revive fires without wasting fuel, how to bank coals overnight. Fire management was winter mastery. Lighting mattered too. Too much light wasted fuel. Too little invited accidents. Lamps were used sparingly. Darkness was accepted. Vision adjusted. Hearing sharpened. People moved carefully. Winter sharpened senses. And then there were animals again. Livestock management changed with the season. Animals were fed carefully. Movement limited to conserve energy. Health monitored closely. Sick animals were treated early. Losing one animal could affect the whole village's survival. Winter made livestock valuable beyond measure. This created a strange intimacy. People knew their animals individually. Their habits, their sounds, their moods. Warmth flowed both ways. Now, stepping back, consider how all of this changes perspective. Winter wasn't just endured, it was integrated. Viking villages didn't see winter as a pause in life. It was a different mode of life, one that required different skills, different values, different pacing. And because of that, winter became manageable. Villages didn't freeze because they didn't insist on living as if it were summer. This seems obvious, but many societies fail here. They cling to old rhythms despite changing conditions. Vikings adapted. They didn't demand productivity. They accepted maintenance. They didn't chase growth. They preserved stability. That mindset kept them alive. Now imagine yourself walking outside briefly. The air bites. Snow crunches softly. The village is quiet, not dead. Smoke rises lazily. Tracks crisscross paths. Life continues. You don't linger. You return inside. Warmth wraps around you slowly. This is winter competence. Not bravery. Not dominance. Competence. And competence is soothing. As we drift onward, we'll soon look at how these winter adaptations influenced Viking expansion, settlement patterns, and the confidence to live in places others avoided. But before we do, I'll leave you with another gentle question. One that doesn't require an answer right away. If winter forced you to slow down, simplify, and focus only on what truly mattered, what would you keep? And what would you quietly let go? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever they come to you, or whenever the night feels open enough to share. Let's drift onward again, quietly, as if the village itself is breathing and we're simply following the rhythm. Outside, winter still holds everything in a careful, pale grip. Inside, the longhouse hums with low life. Embers glowing, furs shifting, people half awake and half lost in thought. By now, winter is no longer surprising anyone. It has become familiar, predictable, almost instructive, because what Viking villages learned in winter didn't stay in winter. It traveled. The habits formed during these long, cold months shaped how Vikings moved through the wider world, how they settled new lands, how they dared to live where others hesitated, and why. When they reached places like Iceland, Greenland, and the far edges of the North Atlantic, they didn't immediately freeze and vanish. Winter competence became confidence. When Vikings looked at a harsh landscape, they didn't see impossibility. They saw a set of conditions that required adjustment. They asked quiet questions. Where does the wind move? Where does snow gather? Where can heat be held, shared, reused? They brought winter with them, not the suffering, but the knowledge. New settlements followed familiar patterns. Homes built low and thick. Turf walls stacked carefully. Villages clustered for shared warmth and labor. Fires managed conservatively. Animals integrated into shelter systems. Even far from Scandinavia, winter logic applied. In Iceland, where trees were scarce, turf and stone became even more important. Long houses sank deeper into the earth. Walls thickened. Heat was treasured like currency. In Greenland, where winters were brutally unforgiving, survival depended almost entirely on applying lessons learned generations earlier. Seal fat replaced wood as fuel. Diets shifted toward marine mammals. Clothing adapted, and villages persisted. Not comfortably, but persistently. This adaptability is often overlooked when Vikings are portrayed as reckless adventurers. In reality, expansion required caution. New lands demanded observation. Mistakes were costly. Winter exposed them quickly. Settlements that ignored winter logic failed. Those that respected it endured longer. This wasn't heroic. It was methodical. Winter had taught Vikings to think long-term, to prioritize stability over short-term gain, to recognize limits and work within them. That mindset carried into travel. Voyages were planned carefully. Ships were built with winter in mind. Sturdy, flexible, reparable. Crews understood seasonal timing. Sailing avoided winter storms whenever possible. When winter travel was unavoidable, preparations intensified. Supplies increased. Risks minimized. Leaders chosen for steadiness rather than bravado. Again, winter shaped behavior. And here's something quietly ironic. The same winter skills that kept Viking villages warm also made them effective neighbors or dangerous enemies. Depending on circumstances, they understood endurance. They knew how to wait, how to persist, how to apply pressure slowly. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's stay with the village. Winter also influenced how Vikings understood land ownership and use. Fields rested. Resources regenerated. Overexploitation was dangerous. Winter enforced restraint. Villages that exhausted their surroundings suffered. Those that managed resources carefully survived longer. This encouraged sustainable practices, not out of environmental philosophy, but necessity. Forests weren't stripped recklessly. Grazing was controlled. Fishing followed patterns learned through experience. Winter punished excess. And so, villages learned balance. This balance extended into social memory. Stories of failed settlements circulated quietly. They built too high. They ignored the wind. They wasted fuel. Lessons were encoded into narrative. Children absorbed these stories as warnings. Not dramatic, but practical. Winter also shaped how Vikings thought about home. Home wasn't defined by comfort. It was defined by resilience. A good home held heat, protected people, endured storms. Everything else was secondary. This made Vikings less attached to luxury and more attached to function. Ornamentation existed, yes, but not at the expense of survival. Beauty was subtle. Carvings on tools, patterns in textiles, details that didn't compromise warmth. Winter refined aesthetics. Now, consider how this worldview contrasts with ours. Modern life often treats discomfort as failure. Vikings treated it as information. Cold wasn't an enemy, it was data. If you were cold, something needed adjustment. Clothing, fire, behavior, not panic. This calm problem-solving prevented disaster. And because winter was predictable, it reduced fear. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Winter certainty, harsh but consistent, allowed planning. Villages didn't freeze because they weren't surprised. As winter slowly loosened its grip, signs were noticed. Slightly longer days, softer snow, animals stirring more. People commented quietly. No celebrations yet. That would be premature, but anticipation grew. Winter's end was not sudden. It faded, slowly, reluctantly, and villages eased back into movement. But winter knowledge stayed. Every year reinforced it. Every generation added nuance. And this continuity is perhaps the deepest reason Viking villages didn't freeze. They inherited solutions. They didn't reinvent survival each year. Memory was insulation. As we drift onward, we'll soon look at how winter shaped Viking childhood specifically, how growing up in this environment created adults uniquely suited to endurance, patience, and adaptation. But before we do, let me leave you with another gentle question, one to carry softly into the night. If you grew up learning that hardship was normal, temporary, and manageable, how you think that would change the way you face difficulty later in life? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake, or whenever the darkness feels kind enough to listen. Let's drift onward again, slowly, quietly, as if the village itself has begun to breathe a little differently. Outside, winter still rules, but it no longer feels endless. Inside, something subtle is happening. Something that has been happening all along, really, but is easier to notice now if we look carefully. The shaping of people. Because long before Viking children learned to sail, fight, or speak in confident voices, they learned winter, not as a lesson delivered formally, but as a background presence that shaped their bodies, habits, expectations, and sense of what life required from them. Winter was their first teacher. Children in Viking villages were not sheltered from winter in the way we might imagine shelter today. They weren't exposed recklessly, but they weren't insulated from reality either. From infancy, they experienced the rhythm of cold and warmth, light and darkness, scarcity and sufficiency. They learned early that comfort was conditional. Babies were swaddled carefully in layers of wool and fur, kept close to bodies, tucked near fires. Mothers and caregivers were vigilant, adjusting coverings constantly. Too cold was dangerous. Too warm wasted energy. Balance mattered. This attentiveness trained everyone's awareness. You noticed temperature. You noticed drafts. You noticed subtle changes in the environment because ignoring them had consequences. As children grew, they absorbed winter rules without instruction. Where to sit, where not to sit, when to move, when to stay still. They learned not by being told, but by watching. Observation was valued. Winter discouraged impulsive behavior. A child who ran carelessly outside risked injury. A child who wasted food risked reprimand. Not harsh punishment, but serious correction. Winter corrected behavior naturally. Children were given small responsibilities early. Carrying kindling, watching embers, helping mend clothing. These tasks weren't busy work. They mattered, and children knew it. This sense of contribution mattered deeply. It created belonging. It taught that survival was shared, and shared survival shaped identity. Winter also shaped patience. There was no rushing spring, no demanding sunlight. Children learned to wait, to endure boredom, to find quiet amusements. Games were simple. Stories were repeated. Toys were handmade. Entertainment didn't arrive externally. It was created internally. This cultivated imagination, but also tolerance for stillness. Stillness is not inactivity. It is restraint. Viking children grew up comfortable with restraint. Darkness played a role here too. Long nights meant more time indoors, more listening, more storytelling. Children memorized myths not because they were drilled, but because repetition made them familiar. These stories embedded values quietly. Endurance, cleverness, respect for limits, acceptance of fate. Heroes didn't always win. God suffered. Survival often came at a cost. This realism mattered. Children weren't promised that life would be easy. They were shown that life was survivable. Winter also shaped physical development. Cold air strengthened lungs. Heavy clothing built strength. Walking on snow trained balance. Carrying loads built endurance. Bodies adapted slowly. Naturally, nutrition in winter was dense but monotonous. Children learned to eat what was available. Preferences mattered less than sustenance. This reduced fussiness. Hunger encouraged gratitude. Again, not romantic. Practical. And winter taught emotional regulation. Crowded spaces meant limited privacy. Children learned to manage frustration quietly. Loud emotional outbursts were discouraged, not punished harshly, but guided back into calm. Winter did not tolerate chaos. This doesn't mean children were joyless. Laughter existed. Play happened, but it was quieter, more contained. This environment produced adults who were steady, not unfeeling. Steady, and this steadiness fed back into village survival. Adults who grew up this way didn't panic easily. They didn't expect constant stimulation. They didn't collapse when conditions worsened. Winter had taught them that hardship was a phase, not a verdict. Now consider how this shaped decision-making later in life. When a storm delayed travel, adults waited. When food ran low, they rationed calmly. When conflict arose, they delayed resolution until conditions improved. Winter had trained patience into muscle memory. And this brings us back to why villages didn't freeze. Because freezing isn't just physical, it's psychological. Panic wastes energy. Despair weakens cooperation. Impulsiveness creates risk. Viking childhoods minimize these vulnerabilities. Winter didn't produce fearless adults. It produced realistic ones. And realism is powerful. Now imagine a child sitting near the fire, listening to elders talk quietly about past winters. The child absorbs tone as much as content. Calm voices, measured words. No panic. This emotional modeling mattered. Winter also taught humility. Nature was larger, stronger, and different. People adapted rather than dominated. This humility prevented reckless decisions. Now, as winter slowly moved toward its end, children noticed changes first. Light lingered longer. Snow softened. Animals stirred. Children pointed it out excitedly, only to be gently reminded not to rush. Hope was permitted, but moderated, and this balance carried forward. As adults, Vikings could endure long voyages, uncertain futures, and difficult settlements because they were not shocked by hardship. Winter had made difficulty familiar. This familiarity is perhaps the most overlooked reason Viking villages didn't freeze. They didn't see winter as an aberration. It was part of life, integrated from birth. Now let's return briefly to the longhouse. A child falls asleep mid-story. Someone gently adjusts a fur. The fire crackles softly. Outside, winter listens. Inside, another generation is learning how not to freeze. As we drift onward, we'll soon explore what happened when winter finally loosened its grip, how villages transitioned back into movement, and why spring was approached cautiously rather than celebrated wildly. But before we do, I'll leave you with another quiet question to consider. If you grew up learning that discomfort was normal, manageable, and temporary, do you think you'd face uncertainty differently as an adult? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake, or whenever the night feels calm enough to answer. Let's drift onward again, softly, without rushing, because winter, though it may be loosening its grip, doesn't appreciate impatience. The village still moves carefully. The longhouse still smells of smoke and wool and lingering cold. But something has changed, almost imperceptibly at first. The way it always does. Light is returning. Not dramatically. Not triumphantly. Just enough to be noticed. A few extra minutes at dawn. A slightly less oppressive darkness at midday. No one announces it loudly. That would tempt disappointment. Instead, people acknowledge it quietly, the way you acknowledge a stubborn neighbor finally leaving their house. Yes, you notice, but you don't celebrate yet, because Vikings understood something very well. Spring is not a switch. It is a negotiation. And winter has a habit of reminding people who speak too soon. So the transition from winter to spring was handled with care. Villages didn't immediately change behavior. Fires were still managed conservatively. Food still rationed. Clothing still layered. No one assumed the worst was over until it very clearly was. This restraint mattered. Early thaws could be deceptive. Ice weakened. Snow melted unevenly. Flooding threatened. Travel became dangerous again as frozen routes turned unstable. Ironically, this in-between period could be more dangerous than deep winter, and Vikings knew it. So they moved slowly. Tasks shifted subtly. Tools were checked. Boats inspected but not launched. Fields observed but not worked. Animals allowed slightly more movement but still monitored closely. Winter habits faded gradually, not abruptly. This patience prevented accidents. Villages that rushed spring often paid for it. Now, emotionally, this period was complex. After months of restraint, Energy returned. Restlessness stirred. People wanted to move, decide, act. But winter training moderated this impulse. People talked through plans quietly. What repairs were needed? Who would travel? What resources were available? Spring became a planning phase, not an explosion. And this careful transition was another reason villages didn't freeze, literally or metaphorically. They didn't shatter under change. Winter had taught them continuity. Children noticed a change in light with particular enthusiasm. Elders tempered it gently. Not yet. That phrase appeared often. This generational balance mattered. Youth brought energy. Elders brought caution. Neither alone was sufficient. Now, let's consider how winter's end affected social dynamics. Conflicts postponed during winter resurfaced cautiously. Grievances discussed calmly. Decisions delayed now addressed. But winter restraint lingered. People were careful not to unravel the cohesion that had kept them alive. Disputes were resolved publicly, with witnesses reinforcing trust. No one wanted unresolved tension going into the active season. Winter had taught them that unresolved tension wastes energy, and energy was about to be needed. Spring also brought physical challenges. Bodies readjusted to movement. Muscles stiff from inactivity needed conditioning. Injuries happened if people pushed too hard too fast. So work resumed gradually. Fishing expanded first. Coastal waters opened earlier than fields. Fresh food returned slowly. Diets adjusted carefully. Then livestock grazing increased. Fields prepared. Planting approached deliberately. This staged approach prevented burnout and collapse. Again, winter logic applied. Even spiritually, winter didn't release its hold immediately. Rituals acknowledged the transition cautiously. Thanks were given quietly. Requests for continued balance made. No triumph, just gratitude. Now imagine the longhouse as it changes. Doors open more often. Smoke disperses faster. People spend a little more time outside, but the fire remains central. Winter leaves traces. Habits don't vanish overnight. And this is perhaps the most important thing. Winter never truly disappears from Viking life. It shapes expectations year-round. Summer abundance is enjoyed, but not trusted blindly. Surplus is preserved. Repairs done early. Preparation begins almost as soon as winter ends. This might sound exhausting, but it created security. Villages didn't freeze because they were always slightly ahead of winter. Not anxiously, methodically. And this cycle repeated year after year. Now, consider the psychological effect of this continuity. Life wasn't divided into chaos and relief. It was a steady rhythm. Winter didn't feel like an interruption. It was part of the pattern. And patterns are calming. As we drift onward toward the final parts of our story, we'll soon reflect on why modern perspectives often misunderstand Viking winter life, and what lessons quietly remain relevant. But before we step into that reflection, let me leave you with another gentle question to carry with you. When a difficult season in your life begins to ease, do you rush forward eagerly or do you move cautiously, carrying lessons with you? Tell me your thoughts in the comments whenever you wake or whenever the light feels just a little longer than before. Let's drift onward again, softly, almost imperceptibly, because now the village itself seems to breathe differently. Spring is edging in, but we're pausing, taking the long view. From a distance, winter looks less like an enemy and more like a teacher. One that isn't dramatic or boastful, but firm and unyielding, and perhaps a little quiet in its wisdom. When you look at a Viking village from above, or at least imagine it, you notice patterns. Homes cluster strategically. Fires glowing faintly in predictable spots. Smoke curling in measured wisps. Children moving deliberately. Elders observing quietly. Animals integrated seamlessly. Everything has a place, a rhythm, a relationship to the season. Winter, we now understand, shapes not just survival, but perception. And stepping back, we can see the lessons it imparts. First, the concept of preparation. Vikings didn't merely react to winter, they anticipated it. Observations accumulated over generations. How snow falls, how ice forms, how storms behave, became common knowledge. Structures were built not to impress, but to endure. Clothing wasn't fashion forward. It was functional. Diets weren't about indulgence. They were about continuity. And yet, when you look closer, these practical adaptations intertwine with social behavior, culture, and belief. The need for survival created habits of patience, cooperation, and observation. Nothing was wasted. Energy, resources, even human attention. Winter also created resilience. It demanded that people endure monotony, scarcity, and discomfort without panic. That endurance became a quiet, pervasive skill. Adults emerged from winter with tempered nerves, calm decision-making, and subtle competence. Communities didn't just survive. They thrived, in the sense that they could maintain social cohesion and operate efficiently under constraints. Now, the wider perspective becomes even more interesting when we consider Viking expansion. Places like Iceland, Greenland, and the North Atlantic islands were far from hospitable. But the same skills honed during months of darkness allowed exploration. Villages carried their winter logic with them. Knowledge of shelter, preservation, fire management, and risk assessment made previously unimaginable settlements viable. Viking expansion wasn't reckless. It was calculated. Bold, yes, but guided by a lifetime of winter learning. Without that, many of these distant settlements would have failed immediately. The same principles that kept small communities warm and fed translated into success across new, unknown landscapes. From this distance, winter seems less oppressive and more educational. It becomes a teacher of resourcefulness, patience, and foresight. And we notice another effect, the psychological conditioning of the population. People were trained from birth to expect hardship, manage discomfort, and function efficiently under pressure. The mental and emotional resilience was as critical as food or warmth. Communities reinforced this resilience collectively. Shared experience during winter, long nights, crowded homes, shared labor, produced social cohesion. Conflict was minimized, not by force, but by necessity. Disputes deferred, grievances monitored, cooperation incentivized. Survival required it, and people adapted accordingly. Children learned quietly from example. They absorbed social norms through observation, habit, and gentle correction. Play, stories, and small responsibilities reinforce endurance, patience, and the understanding that individual action had communal consequences. By the time they became adults, these skills were ingrained, instinctual, almost invisible in their operation, but critical. From this high vantage, we see that winter was a system of natural education, not in a formal sense, of course, not with teachers or curriculums, but deeply embedded in the rhythms of daily life, the seasons, and the village itself. Winter molded both environment and inhabitant, simultaneously shaping resources, behavior, and culture. And yet, when spring finally arrived, it was treated cautiously. The same patience that had been necessary during the darkest months carried forward. Villagers didn't rush into planting or travel. They assessed risk. They monitored conditions. They moved deliberately. This measured approach further reinforced survival. Lessons of winter lingered in every action. It's worth noting that winter's influence extended beyond survival into social memory and storytelling. Tales, myths, and history preserve lessons. Fimbulwinter, God's actions, successful and failed settlements. All these stories reinforce behavioral norms. They weren't entertaining in the way modern audiences might imagine. They were functional, instructive, and calming. Familiarity brought order. Narrative became insulation. And so, if we pull even further back, we see the remarkable continuity of these lessons. Generation after generation, knowledge of the environment, behavioral norms, survival strategies, and psychological conditioning passed seamlessly. Villages maintained cohesion. Settlements endured. Expansion became possible. Winter shaped culture, population, expansion, and survival. It became the backbone of life, and yet remained subtle, not feared unnecessarily, not romanticized, just acknowledged, integrated, respected. As we drift onward, consider this quietly. Modern life often treats difficulty as interruption. Vikings treated difficulty as a structure, a tool, a rhythm. What might you learn from that perspective? How might your own approach to hardship change if you saw difficulty not as an obstacle, but as a shaping influence? Hold that question gently. And when you're ready, we'll drift softly into part 12, where we reflect on the full circle of winter, life, and legacy, and see how the lessons of the North echo quietly even today. Let's drift onward again, softly, almost imperceptibly, because now the village itself seems to breathe differently. Spring is edging in, but we're pausing, taking the long view. From a distance, winter looks less like an enemy and more like a teacher, one that isn't dramatic or boastful, but firm and unyielding, and perhaps a little quiet in its wisdom. When you look at a Viking village from above, or at least imagine it, you notice patterns. Homes cluster strategically, fires glowing faintly in predictable spots, smoke curling in measured wisps, children moving deliberately, elders observing quietly, animals integrated seamlessly. Everything has a place, a rhythm, a relationship to the season. Winter, we now understand, shapes not just survival, but perception. And stepping back, we can see the lessons it imparts. First, the concept of preparation. Vikings didn't merely react to winter, they anticipated it. Observations accumulated over generations. How snow falls, how ice forms, how storms behave, became common knowledge. Structures were built not to impress, but to endure. Clothing wasn't fashion-forward. It was functional. Diets weren't about indulgence. They were about continuity. And yet, when you look closer, these practical adaptations intertwine with social behavior, culture, and belief. The need for survival created habits of patience, cooperation, and observation. Nothing was wasted. Energy, resources, even human attention. Winter also created resilience. It demanded that people endure monotony, scarcity, and discomfort without panic. That endurance became a quiet, pervasive skill. Adults emerged from winter with tempered nerves, calm decision-making, and subtle competence. Communities didn't just survive, they thrived, in the sense that they could maintain social cohesion and operate efficiently under constraints. Now, the wider perspective becomes even more interesting when we consider Viking expansion. Places like Iceland, Greenland, and the North Atlantic islands were far from hospitable. But the same skills honed during months of darkness allowed exploration. Villages carried their winter logic with them. Knowledge of shelter, preservation, fire management, and risk assessment made previously unimaginable settlements viable. Viking expansion wasn't reckless. It was calculated. Bold, yes, but guided by a lifetime of winter learning. Without that, many of these distant settlements would have failed immediately. The same principles that kept small communities warm and fed translated into success across new, unknown landscapes. From this distance, winter seems less oppressive and more educational. It becomes a teacher of resourcefulness, patience, and foresight. And we notice another effect, the psychological conditioning of the population. People were trained from birth to expect hardship, manage discomfort, and function efficiently under pressure. The mental and emotional resilience was as critical as food or warmth. Communities reinforced this resilience collectively. Shared experience during winter, long nights, crowded homes, shared labor, produced social cohesion. Conflict was minimized, not by force, but by necessity. Disputes deferred, grievances monitored, cooperation incentivized. Survival required it, and people adapted accordingly. Children learned quietly from example. They absorbed social norms through observation, habit, and gentle correction. Play, stories, and small responsibilities reinforced endurance, patience, and the understanding that individual action had communal consequences. By the time they became adults, these skills were ingrained, instinctual, almost invisible in their operation, but critical. From this high vantage, we see that winter was a system of natural education. Not in a formal sense, of course, not with teachers or curriculums, but deeply embedded in the rhythms of daily life, the seasons, and the village itself. Winter molded both environment and inhabitant, simultaneously shaping resources, behavior, and culture. And yet, when spring finally arrived, it was treated cautiously. The same patience that had been necessary during the darkest months carried forward. Villagers didn't rush into planting or travel. They assessed risk. They monitored conditions. They moved deliberately. This measured approach further reinforced survival. Lessons of winter lingered in every action. It's worth noting that winter's influence extended beyond survival into social memory and storytelling. Tales, myths, and history preserve lessons. Fimbulwinter, God's actions, successful and failed settlements. All these stories reinforce behavioral norms. They weren't entertaining in the way modern audiences might imagine. They were functional, instructive, and calming. Familiarity brought order. Narrative became insulation. And so, if we pull even further back, we see the remarkable continuity of these lessons. Generation after generation, knowledge of environment, behavioral norms, survival strategies, and psychological conditioning passed seamlessly. Villages maintained cohesion. Settlements endured. Expansion became possible. Winter shaped culture, population, expansion, and survival. It became the backbone of life, and yet remains subtle. Not feared unnecessarily. Not romanticized. Just acknowledged, integrated, respected. As we drift onward, consider this quietly. Modern life often treats difficulty as interruption. Vikings treated difficulty as a structure, a tool, a rhythm. What might you learn from that perspective? How might your own approach to hardship change if you saw difficulty not as an obstacle, but as a shaping influence? Hold that question gently. And now, as our long journey through cold months, quiet fires, and patient villages comes to a gentle pause, let's linger for a moment more. The longhouse is quieted. Outside, the winter night stretches dark and soft, but inside, warmth and reflection remain. We've seen how Viking villages endured what we might call impossible winters. How children learned patience before they could even walk. How adults moved deliberately, with foresight and calm. How belief, ritual, and subtle social structures guided behavior as reliably as walls and fires. How snow, ice, and wind, once feared, became tools in a life honed for endurance. And how these lessons carried across generations and distant lands. Winter, we've discovered, was never just a season. It was a teacher, shaping minds, bodies, and communities quietly, steadily, without dramatic displays or panic. It taught preparation, observation, patience, cooperation, and resilience. It demonstrated the power of continuity, both in survival and in culture. And perhaps the most remarkable lesson is this. Difficulty, when approached with steady observation, measured action, and calm expectation, becomes manageable. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a guide, a quiet shaping force in life. So, as we settle back, let the fire's warmth linger in your thoughts. Let the steady rhythm of long nights, shared stories, and patient endurance carry into your own life. There is value in slowing down, in observing carefully, in letting challenges teach rather than overwhelm. Even in modern life, the echoes of these lessons remain. If this journey through the wintry lives of Viking villages has brought you calm, insight, or a sense of quiet reflection, please consider liking this video. Share it softly with someone who might appreciate a slow, thoughtful drift through history. Subscribe if you'd like to continue exploring history in this gentle, sleep-inducing style. And here's a final gentle question to leave with you. If you could carry one lesson from the Vikings' winter into your own life, whether patience, preparation, resilience, or quiet observation, which would you choose? And how might it change your seasons, literal or metaphorical? Thank you for drifting with me tonight, for letting history speak in a quiet voice, for allowing the slow rhythm of human endurance to settle gently in your mind. The fire dims, the longhouse sleeps, and you may drift gently into your own rest, carrying the soft lessons of the North with you. Good night.